Wake up! Thought several of you may have been trying to sleep on me, so I thought I'd interject a little enthusiasm. But today's presentation is going to be talking about an area that China has also influenced over its history, and that is the area of Japan. So we talked about last week China, and even Monday and yesterday we talked about China's influence in other areas of the world, especially yesterday talking about China's influence on the United States. So as we talk about Japan, notice some of the similarities in the things that we've already discussed. Now, where is Japan? We've talked in passing the location of Japan the last couple of days. And as you notice there by the arrow, Japan is an island nation just across the water from the countries of North and South Korea. Also a little bit further away is China. So you notice there, represented by the blue, the Japanese islands. There are several islands that make up the country itself. Now, here's another zoomed in version of Japan on the left. You notice there the modern map with the capital of Tokyo there on the map, but also the right side of the screen shows you kind of an illustrated version. And I like this version of the map because you can tell here that whoever illustrated this on the main islands of Japan, you notice the mountainous areas that are denoted there by the drawings and also the shading. We're going to talk about just in a second how much of Japan is a mountainous area, and that's why it has been affected throughout the years of where the people settled. So you notice there the islands itself, the Sea of Japan. Also to the east you have the Pacific Ocean. So of course, as mentioned previously, Japan is an island country. Now, in today's presentation, I want us to look at 7 main ideas dealing with Japan. Okay, first of all, it's going to be Japan's geography. Then secondly, we'll look at the areas of early Japanese settlement, areas of early Japan. Then we're going to talk about the religion of Shinto that is from the area of Japan. Fourthly, we'll talk about Prince Shotoku and the influence from China, which that is something that we have been considering, how China has influenced these areas. Fifth, we'll talk about Japan's art and culture. Sixth, what are shoguns? Not just the restaurant, if any of you have eaten at Shogun, but it is something very important to Japanese history. And then last of all, which many of you have heard of, and that is the concept of the samurai, or the samurai warriors. So let us go forward and start to talk about our main ideas. First of all, Japan's geography. Okay, Japan, as we looked just a second ago, is a chain of islands that stretch north to south in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, the islands of Japan are very mountainous. Okay, they're mountaintops that rise from the ocean floor. Many of Japan's mountains are volcanoes. Okay, some dormant, some may be active. So only about 20% of Japan's land is farmable because of these mountains. Now, think just a second here. How much of the area then is mountainous? If 20% is actual farmable land, how many acreage, or what percentage rather, of Japan's land is not farmable? Hopefully you thought about 80%. So that cuts out a lot of area where early settlers probably did not want to be because they could not farm. For that reason, many people settled in coastal villages to fish for food. So around the coast where they could fish, and these flatter areas where they could farm. So because Japan is an island, another important aspect of the early areas is that there was much trade that took place. Now, the ocean around the islands kept Japan isolated from outside influences. Okay, so it's surrounded by water. People had to get there by one way, and that was by boat. So Japan was an isolated area. As a result, Japan developed an independent society with its own culture. Okay, it was very distinct. We will look at some of these things and how Japan evolved into its own society. Here you see an example of a piece of pottery from about, historians and archaeologists date this around 8000 BC. It is from a people that is considered the Yomon people that lived in Japan in the earliest times. So you see here, even that many years ago, how people were constructing and using things for their daily life. So example of this pottery. So let's talk about these early Japanese people very quickly. The first people to arrive in Japan probably came from Asia around 5000 BC. Now, I know the previous slide said the pottery was from around 8000. Remember, when we're talking about this far back in time, there are some various indifferences in age. Okay, so that's the reason for that. But it was anywhere from around 5000 BC, if not earlier. So they settled the coast and fished. All right, around the coast, like we talked about in Japan, in order to fish. The early Japanese were also organized into clans, or a clan is an extended family, where the leader had power over the people of the villages. Now, if you remember correctly, we talked about this idea with Africa, how people lived in what we considered tribes. Okay, in their villages, you had a leader, and they were independent from one another. So the early Japanese people organized themselves into these clans that were made up of extended families with a leader over the village. Now, some clans became more powerful than others over the years and built up armies. So let's fast forward to 500 AD, so 500 years after Christ. One of those clans, the Yamato clan, had control over large areas of Japan. Okay, so much of the islands of Japan, especially the main island of Japan, was overtaken and ruled by the Yamato clan. Okay, so those are the early Japanese people, the earliest settlers, anywhere from 8000 to 5000 BC, all the way up into the Yamato people around 500 AD. One important thing that we're going to talk about third of all right fast, dealing with religion, is Japan had its own form of religious thought that was known as Shinto. Okay? Now what is Shinto? Shinto is a traditional Japanese religion that focuses on the belief that everything in nature has kami, or nature spirits, okay, or spirits that dwell within nature. All right, now, Shinto first developed from the idea of animism, again going back to that word that we looked at with Africa, and means way of the spirits. All right, so the Shinto people believed that things had spirits that guided life. They looked to these things for blessings. As you notice the last point, they built shrines to the kami, or these spirits, and asked them to bless them. Okay, so this religious thought is known as Shinto, and as you see in the bottom right hand corner, there is a shrine, or a Shinto shrine. Notice the unique architectural style, similar to Chinese, but has its distinctions as Japanese style architecture as well. Here you see some Shinto priests. They are here lined up in probably a ceremonial type display with their dress. Notice very traditional dress, even to this day, that these priests wear. Okay, so the religion of Shinto, very important to Japan. Now, here's where we want to get into talking about how China actually influences Japan. So some of the early settlers, remember, they formed in isolation. They lived on the islands themselves. They may have traded with some areas, but they were not largely influenced until we see a prince by the name of Shotoku. He served as a regent, which is a person who rules a country for someone who is unable to rule alone, whether for sickness or for age or for other reasons. So he served as a regent from the years 593 AD to the year 621. And he brought many ideas to Japan from China. So he is responsible more than any other person or any time for bringing many ideas from China. He sent people over to China. He was interested in learning from the Chinese. So as you notice there in the graph or in the image, first of all, what were some of the influences from China? Well, you see language. Okay, the earliest Japanese writings used Chinese characters, as you can tell. Also, philosophy or religion, the ideas of the Chinese philosopher Confucius, helped shape Japanese culture and family life. And then also Buddhism came to Japan from Korea. So we talked about Monday, how Buddhism came from China to Korea, and then from Korea to Japan. And so we see how it affects many different things and influenced from China itself. Here is one of the most famous temples in all of Japan. It was built during the time of Shotoku, and it is located in the city of Nara, Japan. So again, notice the architectural style and the Buddhist influence in the area of Japan. Now, another important part of Japan's culture deals with its art and its culture itself. So, the capital of Japan was moved to the city of Heian, which is the modern-day city of Kyoto, in the year 794, which is AD. Okay, we're moving on closer or further since the birth of Christ. So in 794, okay, Japanese culture changed from that year all the way up until the year of 1185. So you have a time period from 794 to 1185 when art and culture rapidly and distinctively changed in Japan. Okay, and the first idea comes from fashion. Okay, you start to see beautiful silk robes and decorative fans become popular. Okay, many of those things you can see in China as well. Another aspect of change dealt with literature. This was a time of the greatest writers in Japanese history during this time. And we'll look at an example of a Japanese tanka in just a second. It's a style of poetry. Also, the visual arts. You have paintings, calligraphy, and architecture became more elaborate. You also had things such as performing arts that arise. Paintings, calligraphy, that was in visual art. You have things such as musicians and jugglers and acrobats and actors all entertain the court or the leaders in Japan. So that became very important. Another thing that happens in this time period is that Buddhism that comes over from China changes a little bit. Okay, so you have two main Buddhist beliefs that emerge in Japan. First of all, you have Pure Land Buddhism. Secondly, you have Zen Buddhism. Now, these are very important to remember. You may see some of these ideas as we move forward on the test or exam. So, first of all, Pure Land Buddhism. This type of Buddhism did not require special rituals. Okay, this was practiced by more of the common people. It was more simplistic. It didn't require all of these elaborate or special rituals. Now, on the other hand, Zen Buddhism involved much self-discipline and also meditation. This type of Buddhism was practiced mainly by the warriors or the elite. Okay, so it took a lot of meditation. You often see people in these parts of the country that meditate a lot and focus intently on things. And so make sure you realize the difference between Pure Land Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. Now here's an example like we talked about last slide of Japan's poetry. This is an example of a tanka. Now a tanka is Japan's oldest form of poetry. It is an unrhymed poem of 5 lines. So notice simply it's a poem that doesn't rhyme and it's 5 lines long. So notice this tanka. Pretty colored trees that are orange, red, and yellow in the autumn air. An old barn by the water with a wide fence around it. Okay, very simplistic, but this was a style of poetry that emerged in Japan during this time. So notice what a tanka is again. You're going to have an exercise to do towards the end of class where you are going to write your own tanka. Okay, so it's an unrhymed poem that has 5 lines. Now the last 2 subjects that we're going to talk about is kind of the leadership in Japan. Okay, the warriors, those who are in charge. Now, our first main point is going to be dealing with the shoguns, okay, or the shoguns. Outside of the growing art and literature centered in the city of Heian in the 1100s, life was very different. Okay, so last slide we talked about art and culture in the city of Heian, the modern day city of Kyoto. Outside of that city, guys, things were very different. Life was very different outside of that city. And how was it different? Well, in other parts of Japan, the emperor became distracted by life at the court and other things. So the nobles decided to take power. All right? In particular, two clans fought for power, and the Minamoto clan won the war between the two. So what do we see because of that? Well, they decided to keep the emperor as a figurehead. All right, so the emperor was still there, but he acted as a figurehead, a person who appears to have rule, even though power rests with someone else. Okay, and the Minamotos became what is known as a shogun, okay, or shoguns. So think about this very simple. You had the emperor, but then you had those that rose up against the emperor. Okay, and so they established themselves as shoguns, and the emperor was just kind of there as a figurehead, really not doing anything. Okay, that's how it was structured. Now, shoguns were generals who ruled Japan in the emperor's name. Shoguns ruled Japan for around 700 years. So this idea of a shogun, these generals who had much power, were in rule in Japan. Okay, and one reason for that ability to rule so successfully was because of the samurai. Okay, now many landowners, which in Japan the landowners were known as the daimyo. Okay, they felt that they needed to protect their land, so they hired samurai. Now, if we were going to define samurai, we would define samurai as the trained professional warriors that protected and defended people or land. The word samurai actually means a servant. So these samurai warriors protected the landowners. Okay, they were hired. They had special abilities that they were trained to take part in. And so they carried out different techniques to defend not only the people, but also the land. Okay, they were very skillful fighters in the way that they fought. They also followed a very strict code of laws that was called the Bushido, which means the way of the warrior. So think about it. Just as you have laws and rules and different things such as sports and maybe in martial arts or in other things, the samurai followed a very strict code of law. Okay, strict code called the Bushido. It was the way of the warrior. Honor was also very important to the samurai, and they lived very simple and disciplined lives. Okay, very simple and disciplined lives. The shoguns and samurai fought off invaders such as the Mongols, who we studied about with China, and helped seize civil wars within Japan. What is interesting is this samurai period, this rule by the shoguns and the samurai in Japan lasted all the way into the 1800s. Okay, so just, over 200 years ago, we still saw the samurai and the shoguns existing in Japan. Okay, now since then, Japan is modernized and really changed its form of government. But these ideas are very important to the history of Japan. Now on this slide, you see a museum exhibit that is displaying some of the attire of the samurai soldiers. Now look how protected they were. Look at the dress that they were. It was very flashy. It was very important that the samurai had this gear that they used. Not only were they trained very specially, but they also had very protective armor or their attire that they wore. Okay, so very important to the samurai soldier. Now, these ideas conclude what I wanted us to go over and what I wanted you to realize about Japan. How it started very early on the coast because of its geography. Okay, how that the earliest settlers lived on those coastal areas, how they traded with some areas probably. We also looked at the idea of Shinto and its religion and the belief in these spirits. Then we talked about the influence of China and how things such as religion and philosophy and writing and language came over, especially during the time of Prince Shotoku. Okay. Then we moved on, following that, to talk about its art and culture. Okay. How during the period and in the city of Heian, how things really flourished with their art and their culture. We also discussed the idea of the shoguns and how they rose to power. And then ultimately we just finished here talking about the samurai. So these ideas are very important to Japan, something that in its history can mean a lot not only to us but also to the Japanese people themselves.